In 48 hours, 2 children vanished without a trace from a quiet Canadian town. But what happened next would rewrite everything we thought we knew about solving the impossible. Picture this. You're a parent. Your 6-year-old daughter has a slight cough, so you decide to keep her and her 4-year-old brother home from school. Just a normal Tuesday morning decision. By noon, both children have disappeared into thin air. No witnesses, no leads, no trace. But here's where this story gets incredible, and I mean incredible, because what happened next proves that sometimes, just sometimes, science can work miracles. Have you ever felt that gut-wrenching moment when someone you love just disappears? Have you wondered how families survive when hope seems lost? What would your community do if this happened in your neighborhood? Would strangers drop everything to help search? Would you? Here's the thing about missing children cases that nobody wants to talk about. Most of them go cold. Families are left in perpetual agony, investigators hit dead ends, and communities slowly return to normal, while parents never stop wondering, what if? But what if I told you that a single piece of fabric, smaller than your thumb, and some unusual footprints, would crack a case that stumped investigators for months? What if I told you that this breakthrough didn't just solve one mystery, but revealed something far more sinister than anyone imagined? If stories of resilience and scientific breakthroughs fascinate you, hit that like button right now, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about justice, community, and the incredible power of never giving up. This is the story of Lilly and Jack Sullivan. And trust me, you've never heard anything like it. Let me take you to Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia. If you've never been to rural Canada, imagine this: rolling hills covered in dense forest, winding dirt roads that seem to lead nowhere, and the kind of small-town community where everyone knows everyone else's business in the best possible way. This is where the Sullivan family called home. Picture a cozy house on Garlock Road, where laughter echoed through the rooms and neighbors stopped by just to chat. 6-year-old Lilly Sullivan was the kind of kid who collected interesting rocks and insisted on wearing her favorite blanket everywhere. Her 4-year-old brother Jack followed her around like a shadow, mimicking everything his big sister did. Their mother, Malaya Brooks Murray, was one of those teachers everyone remembers, vibrant, caring, the type who'd stay after school to help struggling students. Their stepfather, Daniel Martell, had embraced his role as dad, with the fierce love you only see in blended families that truly work. On May 1st, 2025, life was absolutely normal. The family attended a community gathering, one of those small-town events where kids run around while adults catch up on local gossip. Multiple witnesses saw Lilly and Jack playing near the historic town park, carefree and happy. Security cameras from nearby businesses captured them laughing, completely safe in their familiar world. That night, as Malaya tucked her children into bed, she had no idea she was living through their last normal day. Here's something that'll hit you in the gut. The decision that changed everything was made out of love. The next morning, May 2nd, Lilly woke up with a slight cough. Nothing serious, just that tickle in her throat kids get during flu season. But Malaya, being the protective mother she was, made a call that millions of parents make every day. She decided to keep both children home from school. Think about that for a second. How many times have you made a similar decision? Keep the kids home when they're a little under the weather, just to be safe. It's such an ordinary choice, made with the best intentions. But sometimes ordinary decisions have extraordinary consequences. And that's our first life lesson from this case. We never know which seemingly insignificant choices will alter the course of our lives forever. The decision to stay home that day wasn't wrong. It was made with love and care. But it placed Lilly and Jack in the path of something unthinkable. As morning turned toward midday, in the Sullivan household, Malaya was probably thinking about lunch, maybe planning to check on Lily's cough later. Daniel was handling his usual routines. Everything was quiet, peaceful, normal. Until 10 a.m., when normal ceased to exist. Daniel Martell's discovery at 10 a.m. on May 2nd, 2025, was every parent's worst nightmare compressed into a single terrifying moment. The house was too quiet. You know that feeling, right? When you suddenly realize you haven't heard your kids in a while, and that parental alarm starts going off in your brain. Daniel felt it. He called their names. Silence. He checked their rooms. Empty. He searched the house, then the yard, then the immediate neighborhood. Lilly and Jack Sullivan had simply vanished. In small communities like Lansdowne Station, children wander. It happens. Kids get curious, chase a butterfly into the woods, lose track of time playing by a creek. For the first hour, everyone assumed this was one of those stories, scary in the moment, but ending with relieved laughter when the children turn up dirty and apologetic. But as minutes stretched into an hour, then two, the gravity of the situation became undeniable. At 12:25 p.m., the Royal Canadian Mounted Police issued their alert. 2 vulnerable children missing in Pictou County. Within minutes, that alert spread like wildfire through social media, local radio stations, and the community grapevine that makes small towns both wonderful and terrifying. What happened next will restore your faith in humanity. Over 100 volunteers materialized out of nowhere. Neighbors dropped everything. Strangers drove from neighboring towns. A retired search and rescue coordinator organized grid searches. Local business owners provided food and water. Helicopter pilots volunteered their aircraft. Drone operators offered thermal imaging equipment. Before we continue, I need to ask, have you subscribed to True Crime Village? This investigation is about to take turns you won't see coming, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. But here's what made everything worse. The weather turned against them. Rain began falling that first afternoon, not a gentle spring shower, but the kind of relentless downpour that turns forest paths into muddy streams and makes aerial searches nearly impossible. For 48 critical hours, while volunteers trudged through increasingly impassable terrain, the elements seemed determined to wash away any trace of the missing children. Thermal imaging cameras mounted on drones swept across rain-soaked landscapes, their operators staring at screens full of grey static. Search dogs struggled to pick up scents in the saturated air. Hundreds of hours of video footage were recorded, every frame later scrutinized for the smallest sign of 2 small children. By the end of that first week, despite every technological advantage and an army of volunteers, the searches had yielded nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no indication of which direction the children might have gone. And that's when the crushing realization settled over everyone involved. Lilly and Jack Sullivan hadn't just wandered off. Someone had taken them. Here's our second life lesson. When crisis strikes, communities reveal their true character. Lansdowne Station didn't just produce volunteers, it produced heroes. People who had never met the Sullivan family, spent days trudging through dangerous terrain in horrible weather, driven by nothing more than the belief that every child deserves to come home safely. That kind of community response, it doesn't happen everywhere. It's precious, and it's powerful, and it would prove crucial to what came next. The transition from a missing persons case to a criminal investigation doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual, gut-wrenching shift that occurs as evidence mounts and innocent explanations evaporate one by one. For the RCMP investigators, several factors began pointing towards something far more sinister than 2 children getting lost in the woods. First came the witness testimonies that didn't quite add up. Neighbors reported seeing unusual vehicles near the Sullivan property. Others mentioned strangers asking questions about local families in the days before the disappearance. Individually, these reports seemed insignificant. Together, they painted a disturbing picture. Then came the discovery that changed everything. On May 8, 2025, 6 days after the children vanished, a volunteer searcher found something near a seldom-used trail adjacent to the Sullivan property. It was small, easily overlooked, tucked beneath dense undergrowth like someone had tried to hide it. A piece of fabric, faded purple with a distinctive pattern. Malia Brooks-Murray identified it immediately, part of Lilly's cherished blanket. Now, here's where modern forensic science becomes absolutely mind-blowing. That tiny fragment of fabric, smaller than a business card, was about to unlock secrets that would reshape the entire investigation. The RCMP's forensic experts didn't just look at the fabric, they dissected it. Using scanning electron microscopy, they examined individual fibers at magnifications so high they could see the molecular structure of the material. They analyzed the weave pattern, the dye composition, even microscopic traces of where the fabric had been and what it had touched. The results were conclusive. This was definitely from Lilly's blanket. But more importantly, the location where it was found, buried in undergrowth, far from any natural path a 6-year-old would take, suggested it had been deliberately discarded. Someone had taken that blanket. Someone had torn it. Someone had tried to hide the evidence. But the fabric was just the beginning. Days later, investigators discovered unusual boot prints near a secondary access road, roughly half a mile from the Sullivan residence. These weren't ordinary hiking boots or work boots. The tread pattern was distinctive, unusual, and completely inconsistent with anything local residents typically wore. Using 3D imaging technology that sounds like science fiction, forensic experts created digital reconstructions of those boot prints. They measured depth, analyzed soil displacement, even calculated the approximate weight and gait of whoever made them. Then they ran those specifications against national databases of known criminal suspects, and they got a match. The prints belonged to someone with a history, someone whose previous encounters with law enforcement had been documented, measured, and filed away years earlier for completely unrelated offenses. Here's our third life lesson, and it's crucial. Small details matter more than we think. A fragment of fabric. Some footprints in mud. These seem insignificant compared to the enormity of 2 missing children. But in the hands of dedicated investigators armed with cutting-edge technology, these tiny pieces of evidence become windows into the truth. The case was officially reclassified as a criminal investigation. Specialized units descended on Lansdowne Station, the Major Crime Unit, Digital Forensic Services, the Behavioral Sciences Group, even an underwater recovery team, to search nearby ponds and creeks. But the real breakthrough was still weeks away. And when it came, it would reveal something that would shake everyone involved to their core. June 15, 2025. Mark that date, because it's when months of painstaking investigation suddenly crystallized into a moment of terrifying clarity. Picture the scene. A dedicated command center at the Stellarton RCMP detachment. Walls covered with evidence, photos, timelines, and maps. Investigators had been working around the clock for 6 weeks, following leads that seemed to go nowhere, analyzing evidence that raised more questions than answers. Then, a senior investigator reviewing polygraph test results noticed something that made his blood run cold. During the investigation, several people connected to the Sullivan family had voluntarily submitted to polygraph examinations. Most results were inconclusive or clearly indicated truthfulness. But one individual, a distant relative, who had been present during family discussions about the children's whereabouts, showed significant irregularities. Now, let me be clear. Polygraph tests aren't perfect. They're not always admissible in court, and they can produce false positives. But when a polygraph indicates deception at the same time behavioral analysts notice inconsistencies in someone's timeline, investigators pay attention. This particular relative had provided detailed accounts of their activities on May 2nd. Their story seemed plausible, even helpful. But under closer scrutiny, their timeline didn't match cell phone records, security camera footage, or witness statements from other family members. Simultaneously, and this is where the investigation becomes absolutely incredible, forensic analysis of those mysterious boot prints had progressed from preliminary comparisons to near-conclusive identification. The prints matched a suspect with a disturbing history, previous encounters with law enforcement involving attempted child abductions. But here's where it gets mind-blowing. Digital forensic specialists had been systematically reviewing hundreds of hours of thermal imaging footage captured during those first desperate search days. Using enhanced imaging software that can detect heat signatures hours after they've disappeared, they identified something everyone had missed. A vehicle moving along a side access road during the exact time frame when Lilly and Jack disappeared. A vehicle that matched the suspect's known transportation. If you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that share button right now. Someone in your network needs to hear this story of how science and determination can crack the impossible. 3 separate lines of evidence, polygraph inconsistencies, forensic bootprint analysis, and digital thermal imaging, had converged on the same terrifying conclusion. The Sullivan children hadn't wandered off. They hadn't been victims of an opportunistic crime. They had been targets of a meticulously orchestrated abduction. In an internal memo that would later become part of the official record, investigators wrote, "New evidence indicates the possibility of a meticulously orchestrated abduction rather than an accidental wandering." That single sentence represented a seismic shift in everything they thought they knew about the case. The breakthrough triggered immediate action. Previously exhausted search sites were reopened. Every piece of collected evidence was subjected to renewed forensic analysis. The task force expanded to include experts from Canadian forensic laboratories specializing in child abduction cases. And that's when the real discoveries began. Cross-referencing witness accounts with digital tracking data revealed patterns that had been invisible before. A local taxi driver remembered an unusual inquiry about a license plate number, a number that partially matched the vehicle captured on thermal imaging. A neighbor recalled a suspicious figure loitering near the Sullivan property, but hadn't thought it important enough to report until investigators asked more specific questions. These seemingly unrelated fragments of information suddenly formed a coherent, chilling narrative. The Sullivan children hadn't been random victims. They had been watched, studied, targeted by someone who understood their family's routines and vulnerabilities. Here's our fourth life lesson, and it's one that will stick with you. Truth has a way of surfacing when people refuse to give up. 6 weeks after 2 children vanished, when many cases would have gone cold, dedicated investigators, armed with cutting-edge technology, managed to see patterns that had been hiding in plain sight. The breakthrough wasn't the result of luck or intuition. It was the product of systematic analysis, technological innovation, and the refusal to accept that some mysteries can't be solved. But the story doesn't end with the breakthrough. In fact, that's where it gets really complicated. Let me blow your mind with what modern forensic science can actually accomplish. Because the techniques used in the Sullivan breakthrough sound like something from a science fiction movie. Remember that tiny piece of fabric from Lilly's blanket? Here's what investigators did with it. First, they used scanning electron microscopy, SEM, to examine individual fibers at magnifications up to 100,000 times their actual size. At that level of detail, they could see the microscopic structure of synthetic and natural fibers, identify the specific manufacturing process used to create the fabric, and even detect trace materials that had adhered to the blanket from its environment. But they didn't stop there. Using Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy (FTIR), they analyzed the molecular composition of the fabric dyes. This technique can identify not just what colors were used, but which specific chemical compounds created those colors, allowing investigators to trace the fabric to its manufacturer, and potentially even the batch it came from. The bootprints required equally sophisticated analysis. Investigators used advanced photogrammetry, basically taking hundreds of photographs from different angles, and using computer algorithms to create precise 3D models of the impressions. These digital reconstructions were so accurate, they could calculate the exact depth of each part of the print, the distribution of weight, and the probable height and gait characteristics of whoever made them. Then came the database comparison. The tread pattern was run against national criminal databases, insurance claim records, and even manufacturer databases to identify the specific brand, model, and size of boot. The match they found wasn't just similar, it was forensically conclusive. The thermal imaging analysis is where things get truly incredible. Thermal cameras don't just detect current heat signatures, they can identify temperature variations that linger for hours after a heat source is moved. Using specialized software, investigators could enhance faded thermal signatures, revealing the movement patterns of vehicles and people, even in recordings that initially appeared to show nothing. But here's what makes this truly revolutionary: data integration. None of these techniques would have cracked the case individually. It was the systematic correlation of multiple evidence streams, fabric analysis, footprint reconstruction, thermal imaging, digital metadata from cell phones and security cameras, behavioral analysis of witness statements, and even soil contamination studies that revealed the full picture. Each piece of evidence, when examined alone, could have been explained away or dismissed as circumstantial. But when investigators used advanced data analytics to map the relationships between all these different elements, patterns emerged that were statistically impossible to ignore. Here's our fifth life lesson. We're living through a revolution in how justice works. The same technologies that power artificial intelligence, medical diagnosis, and space exploration are now being used to solve crimes that would have remained mysteries just a decade ago. The Sullivan breakthrough wasn't just about finding 2 missing children. It was a demonstration of how scientific collaboration can overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Forensic experts, digital analysts, behavioral psychologists, and field investigators worked together in ways that would have been unimaginable to previous generations of law enforcement. This integration of multiple scientific disciplines created what investigators call a convergence of evidence, a situation where separate lines of inquiry all point toward the same conclusion with such statistical probability that doubt becomes virtually impossible. But the most important aspect of the scientific breakthrough wasn't the technology itself. It was the human determination to use every available tool in service of finding the truth. Someone had planned and executed the abduction of 2 innocent children. Science gave investigators the weapons they needed to fight back. The breakthrough in the Sullivan case didn't just impact the investigation, it sent shockwaves through the entire community and beyond. In Lansdowne Station, residents who had spent weeks wondering if they were safe in their own homes finally had answers. The relief was palpable, but so was the anger. Learning that someone had been systematically planning to harm local children transformed fear into determination. Community meetings that had been focused on search coordination suddenly shifted to prevention and protection. Parents who had been paralyzed by uncertainty could now take concrete steps to keep their families safe. The media played a crucial role throughout this process. National news outlets had been covering the Sullivan case from the beginning, but the breakthrough transformed it from a local tragedy into a case study in modern investigative techniques. Documentaries began production. Criminal justice programs at universities started using the case as a teaching example. But the most significant impact was on investigative protocols themselves. The success of the multidisciplinary approach in the Sullivan case prompted law enforcement agencies across Canada to re-evaluate their own procedures. Training programs were developed to help investigators integrate forensic science, digital analytics, and behavioral analysis more effectively. The techniques that cracked the Sullivan case, particularly the thermal imaging analysis and data integration methods, are now being applied to cold cases that had been dormant for years. Some of these older investigations are suddenly producing new leads, as investigators apply Sullivan-inspired approaches to previously analyzed evidence. As of the most recent updates, several individuals connected to the evidence trail are being closely monitored by law enforcement. While formal charges haven't been announced, the investigation has clearly shifted from searching for missing children to building a prosecution case against identified suspects. Legal experts note that the complex array of evidence types from microscopic fiber analysis to behavioral psychology assessments will create interesting challenges in court. However, the thorough documentation and peer-reviewed forensic methodologies used throughout the investigation should provide a strong foundation for any future legal proceedings. Here's our 6th life lesson. Individual cases can drive systemic change. The techniques developed during the Sullivan breakthrough are now helping solve other crimes. The community response model is being studied and replicated. The integration of scientific disciplines is becoming standard practice. Sometimes tragedy becomes a catalyst for progress. The suffering of the Sullivan family and the Lansdowne Station community contributed to advances in investigative science that will help protect other families in the future. But there's one more lesson embedded in this story, and it's perhaps the most important one of all. As I wrap up this incredible story, I want you to think about what the Sullivan breakthrough really represents. On May 2nd, 2025, 2 children vanished from what should have been the safety of their own home. In that moment, it seemed like the forces of darkness had won. Evil had struck without warning, leaving devastation and despair in its wake. But what happened next proves something profound about human nature and the power of refusing to surrender to hopelessness. A community rallied. Scientists applied their expertise. Investigators worked around the clock. Technology was pushed to its limits, and slowly, methodically, truth began to emerge from the darkness. The fabric fragment from Lilly's blanket wasn't just evidence. It was proof that love leaves traces. The boot prints weren't just forensic data. They were breadcrumbs leading back to accountability. The thermal images weren't just digital recordings. They were windows into moments when evil thought it was hidden. Here are the life lessons I want you to carry forward from the Sullivan case. First, never underestimate the power of community. When over 100 volunteers dropped everything to search for 2 children they'd never met, They demonstrated that human compassion is stronger than individual indifference. Second, science and technology are transforming the fight for justice. Techniques that seemed impossible a generation ago are now standard tools for uncovering truth. Evil can run, but it can no longer hide indefinitely. Third, hope must persist even in the darkest moments. When the Sullivan family had every reason to despair, when the community had every excuse to give up, when investigators faced dead end after dead end, the refusal to surrender ultimately led to breakthrough. Fourth, small details matter more than we realize. A piece of fabric, some footprints, digital anomalies in thermal recordings. These seemingly insignificant elements contain the keys to solving an impossible mystery. Fifth, truth finds a way. Even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces. Even the most sophisticated cover-ups contain flaws. Patience, persistence, and scientific precision can overcome deception. The Sullivan case isn't over. Legal proceedings lie ahead. Questions remain about the full extent of the conspiracy and whether additional victims might be identified. But the breakthrough has already accomplished something crucial. It has restored faith in the possibility of justice. In a world where we're constantly told that some problems can't be solved, some mysteries can't be unraveled, some injustices can't be corrected, the Sullivan breakthrough stands as a beacon of hope. It proves that when human determination combines with scientific innovation and community support, even the impossible becomes achievable. What's the most important lesson you're taking from the Sullivan case? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it restored some of your faith in the power of truth and community, don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Village for more deep dives into cases that changed everything. Because here's what I've learned from years of studying true crime. For every story of darkness, there's a corresponding story of light. For every tale of evil seeming to triumph, there's an account of good people refusing to let that triumph be permanent. The Sullivan breakthrough reminds us that we live in an age of incredible tools for fighting injustice. But more importantly, it reminds us that those tools are only as powerful as the humans who wield them. With courage, compassion, and an unshakable belief that every victim deserves justice, Lilly and Jack Sullivan deserve to grow up safe in their loving home. They deserve to play in their community without fear. They deserved protection from those who would harm children. The breakthrough in their case proves that when that protection fails, when innocence is attacked, when families are shattered, the fight for justice doesn't end. It evolves, it gets smarter, it gets stronger, and ultimately, it wins. The darkness may fall suddenly, but the light of truth, once ignited, burns until every shadow has been exposed. Never give up. Never stop believing. Never accept that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The Sullivan breakthrough teaches us that with enough determination, enough science, and enough community support, even the impossible can be overcome. And that's a lesson worth remembering, worth sharing, and worth living by.